Is it me?
Yeah.
Well, welcome to the Wiggly Sofa. I don't know why I'm introducing this one, but I think it's probably because Rich and Heather have had a fit of the giggles and can't function anymore. But anyway, yesterday, Rich successfully got me on a nature ramble. Now, you might imagine this wasn't something that I would willingly go on, but we had a good day, didn't we, Rich?
We had a very good day, Phil. It's surprising. I mean, you are remarkably good company, I've got to say.
Well, thank you very much.
Despite first impressions. But
shall we have a group hug to celebrate?
Here we go.
But it was great, wasn't it? It was really good. And Rob the Seed came with us, and we walked up and we went up to Phil's permanent set-aside. What a stunning little patch, I've got to say.
Well,
gorgeous.
quite a big patch, really.
Exceeded my expectations big time.
It was quite disappointing in the weather, because I sent Mark Eccleston, our photographer, up there the other day, and it was raining the other day as well, and he came back and said, it's raining, not much interest. And I'd been up there on a sunny day a number of times, and my identification of various species is fairly limited at the best of times. And I wanted one of you guys who knew what you were on about to have a look. And yesterday, although it was raining, there were 30-second bursts of sunshine.
Well, that was incredible, wasn't it?
The butterflies got going, and we saw some insects. And then, of course, with Rob the Seed along, we could actually identify some of the plants.
Yeah.
And whilst there wasn't a whole heap of anything terribly rare, the diversity was there. And
oh, God, enough wittering.
Well, there was some rare stuff there as well, which Rob will tell us about it.
So we'll go and have a listen to the interview. And, dear listener, sorry about him saying
it's
yesterday.
It's not an interview.
Oh, isn't it?
Let's go to the interview. It's not an interview. Okay, guys, well, we finally made it through a very wet countryside, very wet few fields, Phil. So
you've actually got me on a nature ramble, haven't
you? It's great, isn't it?
I never
fantastic.
Thought I'd see the day.
Yeah, well, Rob came over. Rob the Seed came over to talk about a new wiggly range of trees and whatnot. So we thought we'd get him up here to give us the benefits of expertise and talk about the various species that you've got on this massive patch of set-aside.
Well, it's a very opportune moment, because the European Commission are just, as we speak, deciding on whether or not to do away with set-aside to try and cool down the world grain market, because the price of grain has gone up, and notwithstanding floods and all the rest of it, it looks as if it's set to go up some more. And one of the ways of taking the heat out of it, particularly for the livestock producers, is to bring set-aside land back into production. And we, because our farm is mixed farm and sort of up and down and what have you, have fairly obviously set aside the land which is least suitable for arable production. And so we're stood in a field that has been in set aside for at least 10 years.
Yeah.
It was woodland as recently as the 30s, so it's a pretty rough and ready piece of land. But as a wildlife habitat in its set aside state, I don't suspect that there's anything wildly exciting here.
I think you're probably right. I mean, it doesn't look like it's particularly diverse, but the species that are here, of which the colour is quite glorious at the moment. We've got a luxury of 2 seconds of sunshine, and there's a few butterflies thinking, let's make a break for it. Let's make the most of this.
Because this afternoon's going to be a waste of time.
We're going to be washed back down into the bottom of the grass again. But there's a whole load of creeping thistle and rosebay willowherb and what are those yellow flowers called?
Those are ragwort.
Ragwort, that's right.
They're not all ragwort. There are 2 species. There's ragwort, which are the ones that stand a bit taller with a flat yellow floret, and then Rob's going to tell me in a minute what these are.
This is St John's Wort.
St John's Wort.
There we are.
Yeah, fantastic.
A lot of colonising weeds, isn't it?
Well, that's right. I think probably in a field that had been more arable for longer, you'd see less variety of weeds, if you see what I mean. Personally, I thought it was just going to be docks and thistles all over, and that's not the case. But what's interesting for me is that if it has a wildlife benefit, and I'm sure it does have a wildlife benefit, even though there's nothing specifically rare or exciting about it, then if we can manage it and maintain it as it is, rather than go back to trying to plough it up or farm it intensively, I think that might be a better job all ways round. And within the rules of set-aside, which still apply for this year, we're due to top this now.
Yeah.
Which obviously will decimate it.
That would be a shame, wouldn't it? Yeah.
And I mean, wild plants are still flowering. There's still food for insects and cover for little mouses and whatever else.
Definitely, it must be a fantastic hunting ground for owls. Because
they'd love it, wouldn't they?
It's not too difficult. Interestingly, the grass isn't, because it hasn't been improved, the grass isn't too dense. So as a hovering kestrel, you could see a little vole zooming between its burrows. And as far as barn owls are concerned, which there are a couple around here, aren't there?
Yeah, we've got 2 pairs that would hunt over here.
Good habitat for them.
There are 2 sheep in here somewhere.
Really? Yeah.
2 of my neighbours' sheep, they're that wild that we couldn't catch them, and they were last seen in here.
So how many acres is this all told then?
It's about 20 acres in this patch.
So it's a nice size, isn't it?
And it's bordered by woodland on 2 and a bit sides, so that it fulfills the purpose of linking habitats as well, which is another vital part of the sort of countryside patchwork, is hedges and areas of habitat that are linked together.
Fantastic. Well, let's have a wander through. What's your butterfly prowess like, Rob? Because there's a couple of little brown. What's this little
meadow browns here?
Meadow brown, yeah.
It's interesting looking at this. So this is
and a little grasshopper there. You see, now it's quite unusual to find grasshoppers on intensively farmed, arable land, and it just goes to show that this has been undisturbed for such a length of time and to such an extent that those guys are growing here, which is fantastic to see. And that's the quintessential sound of a meadow, isn't it? The grasshoppers rubbing their back legs.
Yeah, I've always been more familiar with sort of rotational set-aside rather than the permanent set-aside. And the fact that this has been
you guys were talking about this. What is there? Why is there a distinction between the two? How does that occur?
It's just a political thing that when set-aside first came out, the idea was that you could have permanent set-aside so that you put it in one place and you were tied to keeping it, and you had to commit to keep it there for, I think it was 5 years, it might even have been 10 years.
Right.
Or you had rotational set-aside. And the idea of that was that you had to have a percentage of your arable land unproductive, but you had to move it round the farm, so that you couldn't keep it in one place. But they stopped that after a couple of years, and so that then allowed us to put rotational side in the same place indefinitely. But it wasn't permanent set-aside, you understand. DEFRA know exactly what they're on about.
Yeah, they do, yeah.
But of course the main benefit of that was that when we moved set-aside around, all that effectively you had was a sprayed off stubble for sort of 8 months of the year, which had very little value of anything.
Excellent.
Whereas in this circumstance, we don't have to spray it off. We're obliged to top it every year after the 15th of July.
Okay.
Or I think actually we're obliged to top it 2 years in 3, I think is strictly speaking the rule. But that begs the question, is that actually the best thing for environmentally? I would suggest not. But
definitely not. I think it's not in this instance. It would be like decimation, wouldn't it, to go across here now and top
But of course, from the government's point of view, they are terribly hung up on the idea that you have to keep this land in good agricultural condition, which basically means that to qualify for set-aside, you've got to be able to plough it up and farm it at any given point. Now, obviously, if I let these little shrubs and what have you that are coming, there's some orals and there's some silver birches that are self-seeded about the place. If I let those get too big, then obviously it's going to be more a bulldozer job than a plough job, and that doesn't fit within the rules. But of course they do give a cover, and they give a variety of food sources in different ways, because there's all sorts of different species here.
Well, silver birch are fantastic. You were saying, Rob, they're one of the first species to sort of colonise prior to mature wood setting.
Yeah, they're considered to be pioneering species, and the interesting part of this is in the sense that it's been down for 10 years. We have got a lot of bramble understory that's moving in, and then we have got some birch, and it appears to be quite a patch over there that I'm sort of itching.
We should go. Well, we should wander. Let's go and wander over there.
It's very interesting that this was topped 2 years ago, so that's why it's due to be topped again this year. So that the bramble growth and the growth of birch saplings and older or oral saplings, they are mostly 2 years old, which shows you how quickly they can establish this understory, from a standing start, really. The other problem, of course, we've got is that the odd ragwort that is here is a very good reason to top it, because being a notifiable weed, we don't want it to spread.
Yeah.
Having said that, it's also a fabulous food source for butterflies.
It is, and it was interesting because was it last summer? I was being a little bit cocky because I saw some cinnabar moth caterpillars on some ragwort down by the farm there, and I was saying, prior to having seen it, I was saying to the guys that went along for a course that you're not going to see these daytime flying moths here, not in this general area because of the way it's farmed and whatnot. Lo and behold, there it was. But I think they must have probably come out from this patch here because I'm just studying the ground to see if I can see any of those yellow and black,
you smell a fox
beautiful
there?
striping.
Actually, you can see where there's probably a litter of foxes here somewhere. You can see where they've been playing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. What is that? Is it like a vetch? What is that, Rob? Exactly.
Yeah, it is vetch,
thick coating. It is a vetch. Yeah. So that's a very pretty plant in its own right, isn't it? When it flowers, delicate flowers. What are the grasses that we've got here?
You've got a lot of Yorkshire fog, common bent. But I think that's one of the things that's slightly different about the permanent set aside to the rotational set aside that I'm probably more familiar with, is that being permanent, you have time for the grasses to move in, and the sward is quite light. There's plenty of room.
It is.
You do get an idea of how wet, because there are these wetland plants that grow, and further over, although this field is in part drained, there are various rushes, and I don't know quite what they're called. I suppose, are these a sedge or not, or are they a rush?
It's a rush, yeah.
Pretty, aren't they? I mean, they do tend to proliferate where the ground is moist.
I suspect that this is a hangover from it being woodland so comparatively recently in its history.
There's a nice mix in here, Phil. I've got to hand it to you. You've inadvertently got a little...
I haven't wrecked it, is what you're saying.
Inadvertently got a fantastic little nature reserve right on the doorstep. It's great.
What was interesting was I was chatting with Hev the other day, and I was sort of saying that from a farmer's point of view, we are going to be responsible for getting rid of areas like this for economic reasons.
Yeah.
And she was asking, well, what are the economic reasons? And when I told her the opportunity costs of growing, say, a cereal crop on here, in terms of some sort of public subscription, public access to it, it was a tiny sum of money to her. And her feeling was, well, let's do something that we can pay the farm the commercial value of a moderate arable crop and then not have one and get outside the subsidy and all this sort of agricultural problem. And I thought, that's where I want to go at.
Absolutely.
I don't particularly, it's quite obviously not ever going to be the best arable field you've seen in your life, but I could quite easily turn it back to sort of semi-intensive grassland, which again would spoil it for what it is now.
It would reduce the amount of species on it significantly, wouldn't it?
Well, totally.
To one, in fact. What are you up to there, Rob? You're peeling that after you're possibly been to try and eat it or something. It has a nice,
bit of a rush and
tasty-looking pithy centre.
We can tell it's a rush because it has that pithy centre.
Right.
But that's many years ago they used to peel the skin back and use this for the wick in candles.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So presumably then the wax is absorbed up, and I can see there are little tiny pores in their core. You're a font of knowledge, Rob. So we've got a few birds. I've noticed the twitterings of little flocks of goldfinches, because those guys are going to be feasting on all this creeping thistle, aren't they, that's in here. Whitethroats, we've seen a couple of whitethroats. They're going to be nesting in the bramble patches. Here we go.
Small skipper.
Small skipper, right. See the butterflies, they just love this bit of sun, and out they'll come.
And bees, look.
Yeah, bumblebees feasting on the thistle heads.
Just 5 minutes of sunshine and everything comes up out of the bottom, doesn't it?
You see, it's amazing. I mean, I've got to say the invertebrates will suffer this year, won't they, do you think, from all this wet? The breeding
probably, yeah. I mean, the start of the year was very good for a lot of the butterflies, but anything that's been hatching over the last couple of months will be pretty much washed out by now.
Yeah, and they just don't seem to have the opportunity to come out and feed and to mate. What we've got here, Rob's just getting a little bit excited about this beautiful, titchy little butterfly. What is that, Rob?
Small skipper.
Is that a little skipper?
Again, we just caught up with it again. A lot of meadow browns as well.
What will their larvae be feeding on, those guys? Grasses?
Sure, but you'll find a lot of the butterflies, although they're feeding, the wildflowers are particularly important as a nectar source for them to feed on. Their larvae are very often feeding on the grasses.
Right.
And it's probably one of the reasons why you've probably got the whole life cycle in this set-aside, which you wouldn't have in a rotational set-aside, because the larvae have been able to feed on the grasses, and then there's the nectar source and the creeping thistles and some of the other flowers. Here's a lot of clover here as well.
There is a lot of clover in here, which is really nice. Of course, bees love that. It's great. Fantastic. Well, should we just wander back down and go back down to see this thicker area of woodland? So, Phil, this is 10 years old. These silver birch that kind of proliferate this bank.
Well, they were topped off to nothing 2 years ago. Might have been 3, but once they decide to grow, they'll grow really quickly.
Yeah,
actually, there are
some
more
of these are
birch
10 foot
here
high
than I thought. There are alders as well further over, but I don't know why this farm, around the margins of a lot of the woods, there are a lot of silver birch.
Right.
And I don't know whether it's the soil or why particularly, but I don't think they were planted necessarily, but obviously they're managing to proliferate themselves.
They do, and they do look really healthy. I mean, you're studying that tree, Rob?
Yeah, well, it is silver birch. We can see by the very warty feel to the stem, and if you run your fingers down the end of those stems, it feels quite rough.
It does, yeah.
Whereas if it was the hairy birch, which is the other birch we get in the UK, that would be covered in hairs and would be very soft to the touch.
Okay. It's such a pretty looking tree. I know it's a common tree, you see silver birch pretty much all over the place, but so for me it's one of my favourites, and it supports so much invertebrate life. There's a whole plethora of something like 150 different types of insects you can find on silver birch.
Yeah.
Catkins as well, Rob.
Yeah, just got to an age, 5 or 6 years old perhaps here, where it's producing its first seed crop.
Right. So now, you as a specialised seed harvester and a chap that knows how to look after these things prior to propagation, what would you have to do to those seeds in order to ensure that they were going to germinate?
This seed would be collected by hand. We'd then do a little bit of processing to clean out any sort of leaf debris that might be in with the seed. It would then be dried to below 10%. And on something like birch, you can have anywhere in the region of a germination of 250,000 to 1.5 million germinating seeds per kilo.
Really? That's quite a lot, isn't it?
So it's very,
probably you don't need a lot of seed here for a forest. Really.
But that probably suggests the success of the birch at proliferating itself across the bottom half of this field.
So when we look at how many we've got here, there's probably 200 or 300 trees in total. It's probably just a very, very small percentage that have germinated from all the seed that's probably been blown over here the last 10 years from the surrounding woodland.
Yeah, gosh.
And you can see the Betula pendula on the edges of these two woods, the very pendulous branches.
Right. That's right, you can. Big mature trees. They're fantastic. How old is something like that? These are the trees that are just on the within the hedge line, really, that have been left to mature.
Yeah, I mean, they're probably 40, 50 years old. Right. Maybe even a little bit more.
I was going to say that hedge line is probably one of the older hedge lines on the farm. That hedge line would have been the boundary of the wood for probably hundreds of years, but that was the boundary of the wood until it was cleared sort of between the wars in the 30s. They did a lot of work on this farm, pushed the wood line back up more or less to where it is now, so that those boundary hedges tend to be the older ones.
Amazing. So these someone came out to my house the other day, Rob. I've got some some hostas that I got from Chelsea Flower Show a couple of years ago. And next to those hostas that are in this big copper are a load of rosebay willowherb, self-seeding rosebay willowherb. Now, you see, for me, these are far more attractive than the hostas that I've got adjacent to them. We were talking about this morning, it would be a difficult thing for people to put in their gardens because they do proliferate like mad, don't they?
They're very vigorous. Quantity of seed produced by each plant must be
there's a lot of seed on there. That's a big head, that's
within these seed heads.
Have things seeded a bit earlier this year because of the terrible weather we've had?
To start off with, on the tree seed that we were harvesting earlier in the year, we were a good 2 weeks early on the willow seed, but very often through the year we find that seed crops average out. Certainly by the time we get through to the end of July, beginning of August, most things have averaged out to be harvested at a similar time of year.
Yeah.
From all the historical records we have. Last year was the first time we've gone through an entire season where we were collecting everything 2 to 3 weeks earlier all through the season. This year has probably already, as far as trees go, averaged out already, despite starting a good 2 weeks early.
Yeah.
It's probably averaged out to be quite normal now.
Right, okay. That's
quite interesting, Rich. I've got a white clover head in my hand, and you were commenting on how dire the sort of weather patterns the last 4 or 5 weeks have been for insects, and as far as I can see, it's totally blind. I don't think it's shed. And clover is one of these plants that needs to be cross-pollinated, usually by bees.
Right.
and the fact that it's blind would suggest to me that it failed to pollinate.
Yeah.
I haven't found a single seed in that
I'm
head.
sure pollination will be shocking this year.
Clover will get away with it because it also reproduces vegetatively with suckers effectively.
Right.
But as perhaps an indicator of what a hard time some of the insects have been having, that probably gives lie to the problems, and presumably those birds and animals that live on insects. I mean, I've noticed that the swallows and house martins are having to work very, very hard to feed any broods.
Yeah,
presumably because there aren't the insects on the wing for them to catch.
Absolutely, and people seem to have more birds visiting their garden for this time of year compared to normal summers, because birds are finding it tougher. There's just not availability of insect life.
It's a resident badger track.
Oh, here we go, look. It's great to be able to recognise things. I mean, because this track, it's very consistent. Yeah, we've got a little badger toilet here right by us. Now, if they were like patches of well-worn bouncing, then we could see that was a rabbit patch. But I
think that may not be. There's a deer slot in there. It's not a badger bog, is it? I think it's possibly where a fox has been digging for something. Mouse, perhaps.
Could be a vole, yeah.
And I suspect that you might be looking at a fox path. I don't know, because I don't know of any significant badger sets at this end of the farm.
Well, certainly a fantastic spot, Phil. It's so. I mean, what's the verdict for this patch? What do you think I'm going to do with
quite
it?
Genuinely, I'm hoping that between us all we can come up with a way of generating enough income, nothing to do with farming, to leave it as set aside.
Yeah.
I think between us we can develop some sort of management technique to, top it perhaps later on in the season when we can keep control of the ragwort and sort of stop the silver birches completely taking over the place and the orals further over.
Yeah.
But if we can extricate ourselves from the rules of the EEC and DEFRA, then we can design a management plan for it that actually benefits what we want it to benefit. And if we can come up with enough money to pay the rent and what have you, then I reckon that's the best way forward.
Brilliant. What do you reckon then, Rob? I mean, what's your verdict on this patch? Is it more inspiring than you thought it might be?
Yeah, these sites often are, as we talking two more small skippers.
Yes.
Covering
through the making the most of it.
Thistles are a great nectar source for these butterflies. Seeds will be eaten by goldfinches and many other birds. So
we ought to just go over the top because the field changes completely over the top.
Well, let's go and walk on the other side anyway.
See if we can find an oak.
So we've just seen the deer just bouncing straight up the bank into the wood. And that's beautiful. That's such a lovely scene, that broken woodland just on the edge of this set-aside. Oh, was a greenfinch over there. Just like a greenfinch. I seem to think I can hear greenfishes in the background.
I think if it stopped raining and the sun had come out properly,
it just doesn't quite know what to do. It wants to rain because it doesn't want to break a habit of the whole summer.
Yeah.
I think the fact that the deer are on here as well, though, is brilliant because there's probably just enough grazing going on just to keep some of the more invasive species down to let some of these smaller things, like Rob just found some common century. We've got some rough hawk-bit here.
Perfect habitat for the fallow deer to give birth in. They don't like having their fawns in the wood. They'd sooner come out of the wood and find some cover out in the fields, and it might be briars or ferns or things. In this case, I suspect it's in amongst these saplings, but it's perfect for them. They'll come and leave the fawn in there, and then we just saw Mum grazing or whatever she was doing. But I'll bet that not very far away somewhere is one of this year's fawn. You'd have a job to catch them by now.
Yeah, that's right.
They will sit dead tight, absolutely motionless, and you can get to within a couple of feet of them and they won't move.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. It's such a nice habitat. There's some buddleia down there, Rob. Yeah. That's interesting. How did I get there, do you think?
Again, very, very light seed, probably brought here by the wind.
I mean, buddleias are great. Well, everybody thinks of it as a butterfly bush, don't they? But aren't there problems with certain species of buddleia, the way they're quite invasive and encroaching into parts of the countryside?
They're not a native plant to the UK, so in some areas there'll be a problem just because they're not native and not required. But again, tiny seed, around 10 million seeds to the kilo.
Right.
So that's an indication as to how light they are. And
that'd want a bit of thinning if you planted it out in a drill, wouldn't it? So it brings new meaning to the word pricking out that lot.
But again, one of the interesting things here is, again, it's an indication as to how much nutrient will have leached out of the ground because it's a tiny seed, just like all the birch trees here. They only germinate on the surface, and it has to be light on the surface to allow them to germinate.
Well, I'm quietly impressed with this spot, Phil, I've got to say.
Well, thanks for that. Sounds like you had a lovely time up the field wandering around and while I was at work. I do hope that if you've got any ideas on the set-aside that you will please email us, heather@wigglywigglers.co.uk or
Richard@wigglywigglers.co.uk
or pwg@lowerblakemere.co.uk.
Or you can leave us a message on our farm phone on +44 1981 500 930, +44 1981 500 930, which would be wonderful. And from a beautiful day in July, for those of you that are listening later in the year, from the Wiggly Sofa, it's bye from me.
Bye from me.
Bye.
Well, thank you for that. Here's a joke. A farmer was milking his cow.
Well, thank you for that. You dismissed that.
I've got a better joke.
Well, thank you for that. I just hope the people.
There was a group of Irishmen working outside the nunnery.
No,
and the Mother Superior. No, it's totally clean.
Oh,
totally
tell you
clean.
what, I've got a great
It's
joke.
not a problem.
Oh, well,
No,
no.
you've got to have this now because I've
No.
started. So the Mother Superior comes out of the nunnery and says to Paddy, "Now look, you boys, I know you're working outside the nunnery."
That's it from the Wiggly Sofa this week. The chat at the field was all right. So that's it. Bye.
Chat from the field was all right. I think we actually should listen to before you make these slightly disparaging remarks about our enterprising little
The
job.
trouble is that she's lost the will to live for some reason. Best known to, she's probably OD'd on antibiotics. Actually, that's what's happened.
Or champers.
But would you like me to do it again?
Let me think.
Okay. Right.